deep in the red clay hills of central Georgia, tucked inside a damaged county courthouse archive. There's a plantation record, so faded it's nearly unreadable. But one line stands out, crisp and strange, something no historian has ever fully explained. No white man has crossed the line of the Rue cabin since the incident of late summer 1857, and none shall be compelled to do so. The 4 enslavers. 4 men who treated human beings as property, who tore families apart as casually as they broke bread, who ruled hundreds of acres and dozens of lives without a second thought. And yet, these same 4 men, together, in writing, refused to approach a single small cabin at the edge of a cotton field. That cabin belonged to a woman named Cora Rue. And what she planted around it, what she did in that soil, in that silence, over the course of 18 months, shifted something fundamental on that land. Her story has never been told in full, until now. Before we walk into that field, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, and drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. We want to know where in the world this story is finding you tonight. What happened on that Georgia plantation in 1857 didn't begin with Cora. It began, as most dark things did in that era, with something painfully ordinary: land, cotton, and the brutal machinery of men who believed they owned everything, including time itself. The Harlan Plantation sat about 11 miles southeast of Milledgeville, Georgia, in Baldwin County, a region that by the mid-1850s had been completely shaped by short, staple cotton. Milledgeville was the state capital then, a place of political ambition and old Southern pride, where men in linen suits debated secession over Bourbon and spoke of their people with a possessiveness that curdled the blood. The countryside was fertile, merciless, and hot. The summers in central Georgia during that decade were especially cruel. Temperatures climbing into the upper 90s for weeks, humidity pressing down like a wet wool blanket, the red clay cracking and bleeding rusty water. After even the lightest rain, the Harlan family had worked this land since the 1820s. Ezra Harlan, the patriarch who'd bought the original 600 acres, was long dead by 1857. The plantation now belonged to his son, Clement Harlan, 43 years old, described in local letters as precise, cautious, and deeply attached to order. Clement wasn't theatrical in his cruelty. No public spectacles, no screaming. His method was quieter and, in some ways, more absolute. He kept meticulous records. He measured everything. Productivity was tracked in units that left no room for human variance, and when numbers fell short, consequences were delivered with the cold efficiency of an accountant closing a ledger. By 1857, Harlan held 41 enslaved people. Their names appeared in Clement's ledgers right alongside his livestock and equipment: first name, approximate age, assigned task, and a brief note on condition. The cabins stood in 2 rows behind the main house, low wooden structures facing each other across a narrow dirt lane. Drafty in winter, suffocating in summer. They smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and the particular human exhaustion that accumulates in small spaces over many years. Cora Rue appeared in Clement's ledger as Cora Approx. 38, field and household, condition sound. That word, sound, was what enslavers used to indicate someone physically intact and economically useful. It said nothing about who Cora actually was, nothing about her being born on another plantation 1 county over, and sold to Harlan at 22 after her first owner died. Nothing about the 2 children she'd carried and lost, one to fever, one to a sail that took a boy named Solomon north into the Carolinas before he was tall enough to look his mother in the eye. Nothing about the years she'd spent quietly learning every plant that grew in Baldwin County's red clay, what each could do, what each meant, and how to make things grow where they weren't welcome. The other 3 planters, whose names would eventually appear in that courthouse document, were neighbors and occasional associates of Clement Harland. Randolph Sutter owned the property to the east, a man in his mid-50s with a short temper and a long memory. Wesley Prout held land to the north. Younger, inherited everything, and never quite shed the unease of someone who hadn't earned what he possessed. Marcus Delavan, who worked an adjacent parcel along the creek, was the most educated of the 4, briefly studied in Savannah and carried his learning like a shield. 4 men, 4 properties. 1 shared boundary along the southeastern edge of the Harland Fields, where the land dipped and the water table rose close enough that certain things grew there that grew nowhere else for miles. That was where Cora's cabin stood. It hadn't always been hers. The structure had been a storage building before Clement, in a gesture of practical reorganization, decided to turn it into a dwelling. He assigned it to Cora in the spring of 1856 for logistical reasons. She'd been doing more fieldwork near that boundary, and this cut her morning travel time. The cabin was smaller than the others, more isolated, set farther from the central cluster. Most of the other enslaved workers considered it an undesirable posting. Too far from warmth and community, too close to the low ground where mosquitoes gathered in clouds at dusk. Cora accepted without visible reaction. She moved her few belongings in one afternoon and spent the first night alone. No one paid much attention to what she did with the ground around it. Not at first. The change began slowly. So slowly that it registered first not as a fact but as a feeling. The kind of peripheral unease people in that era blamed on bad air, evening humors, or simple exhaustion. But by midsummer 1856, several of the Harland field workers later recalled noticing something different about the southeastern boundary. A smell, they said, when the wind came from that direction. Not unpleasant exactly, just complex. Hard to name. Green, sharp, faintly bitter, with an undertone some compared to burnt earth, after lightning, and others described as the smell of a church cedar. Dry herbs. Something they couldn't quite place but felt they should recognize. By autumn, those who walked past Cora's cabin on the way to the eastern fields began to notice the plants. She'd been working the soil around the structure, with whatever she could gather, cultivate, or coax from the ground, during the hours before dawn and after the day's assigned labor was complete. What she planted, and what she allowed to grow where it already wished to grow, formed a ring around the cabin. By October 1856, it was dense enough that you had to pay attention just to walk near the door. There were plants anyone in Georgia would recognize. Sassafras near the northern corner, pennyroyal low along the eastern wall, black cohosh rising in clusters between them. A thick growth of what the older field workers called crow's foot, along the south-facing side, and along the path to the door. She'd placed rows of something none of them could name. A dark, leafed plant with small white flowers that bloomed only at dusk and closed before sunrise, its roots going down into the clay in a way that made the soil around it look almost deliberately disturbed, as though something beneath the surface were responding. She also grew tobacco, not the plantation's commercial crop, but a wild, ungrafted variety she'd cultivated from seeds obtained through channels no one asked about directly, and no one thought it wise to investigate. This tobacco grew low and dense, its leaves broader and darker than commercial strains, curling at the edges in a way that suggested age or stress, or something in the soil that the plant was negotiating with. The woman who first brought this to Clement Harland's attention wasn't a field worker. It was Theodora Prout, wife of the neighboring planter Wesley Prout. One afternoon in late October, she stopped her carriage along the boundary road and found herself staring at the perimeter of Cora's garden with an expression her driver would later describe as hovering somewhere between fascination and revulsion. Theodora prided herself on knowing plants. She kept a formal garden at the Prout house, maintained a small physic garden of medicinal herbs, and had studied several texts on botanical remedies, fashionable among educated women of her class. She recognized some of what she saw, enough to ask questions. That evening she sent a note to Clement Harland. It was brief and didn't explain itself fully, which, in retrospect, may have been more alarming than any direct statement. It read, "Mr. Harland, I observed today the garden of the woman you have stationed at your eastern boundary. I believe you should examine what is growing there before the season changes. Some of what I saw I could not name. Some of what I could name I would rather not put to paper. I remain, as ever, your neighbor in good faith." Clement Harland walked to the eastern boundary the following morning. Later, he recorded the visit in his ledger, and for a man who wrote almost nothing personal among his numerical entries, this stood out. Visited the Rue cabin. Found extensive and unusual cultivation around the structure. Asked Cora about the nature of the plants. She was cooperative in manner, and answered that she grew what was useful to her for cooking and medicine. She could not be faulted directly. The garden is in no way impeding the field work. I will observe further. That phrase, "I will observe further," meant Clement had seen something he couldn't immediately categorize, and his instinct, in the absence of a clear category, was to wait. He was a man of systems, and systems required data before conclusions. He observed further, and over the following weeks, what he observed made him increasingly reluctant to observe at all, to understand what Cora had actually built around that cabin, and why it had the effect it did. You have to understand where she came from. Cora grew up on a plantation in Putnam County, 1 county west, under a minor planter named Peregrine Slade. What the records don't capture is what she learned there from an elderly woman named Mama Thistle, one of the oldest people on the Slade property, who carried knowledge that had traveled a very long distance. That knowledge came from West African traditions, Yoruba, Dahomean, Fon, where plants were used not only as medicine but as spiritual markers, as communication between realms of meaning that Western frameworks had no vocabulary for. It had survived the Middle Passage in fragments, adapted and hybridized with indigenous American plant knowledge and the folk medicine of poor white communities who shared geographic space with the enslaved. By the mid-19th century, it had become something neither purely African nor purely American, but entirely its own. A living system of understanding that practitioners kept hidden from the men who owned them, for obvious and urgent reasons. Mama Thistle had been a practitioner of what the people around her called simply the work. She passed much of it to Cora during their years together on the Slade property. When Cora was sold and moved to Harland in 1834, she carried that knowledge with her. For more than 20 years, she watched, learned the local flora, understood what the red clay of Baldwin County could sustain, and waited. She hadn't been passive. She'd helped women through difficult labors, eased children's fevers, provided remedies for toothache and wound infection, and the particular ailments that come from years of outdoor labor in extreme heat. These services were rendered quietly, and they gave her a standing in the enslaved community that had nothing to do with Clement's ledger. She wasn't feared. She was trusted, which is a very different thing. What she built around her cabin wasn't, in a practical botanical sense, a threat to anyone's physical safety. Pennyroyal sassafras black cohosh. These were plants any knowledgeable person might have grown without comment. The wild tobacco served both practical and ritual purposes. The unnamed dusk, flowering plants, which later accounts suggest may have been a variety of Jimson weed, cultivated and modified over multiple seasons, were more ambiguous in their uses. And that ambiguity was intentional, because what Cora had understood, with a clarity born from decades of observation, was this: she could not stop men like Clement Harland. She could not stop the sales, the separations, the endless extraction of labor. She could not undo what had been done to Solomon. She could not protect everyone. But she could build something around herself that those men did not understand. And in that gap, between what they knew and what she knew, she could create a space that was, in the most fundamental sense, her own. A space that operated according to rules they had not written. The garden wasn't a weapon. It was a boundary, and it communicated to anyone who knew how to read plants something that the era's laws and customs made impossible to say directly. By spring 1857, word about Cora's garden had spread among the enslaved population of the neighboring plantations in a way that had no parallel among the white planters. Field workers who passed the boundary brought descriptions back to the Sutter, Prout, and Delavan properties. Women who came to Cora for help saw the garden and understood, in different degrees and different languages, what it represented. Some began asking what they could do, what they could plant, what they could learn. Cora taught carefully and selectively, just as Mama Thistle had taught her. Clement noticed the increased traffic at his eastern boundary. He noted it in his ledger. He didn't fully understand what he was noting. And then came the summer of 1857, and the incident that would eventually find its way into a courthouse document in Baldwin County. The summer of 1857 was the driest in more than a decade. By June, creeks had dropped to half their normal levels. Cotton in the central fields showed signs of stress, leaves curling inward during the hottest part of the day, a defensive response to moisture loss that Clement watched with the tight-jawed expression of a man calculating losses in real time. The neighboring planters suffered similarly. Sutter lost part of an eastern field to blight. Prout's well went brackish. Delavan started hauling water by wagon from 2 miles north. But on the Harland eastern fields, the ones bordering Cora's cabin, production was confounding expectation. Workers reported that the soil there felt different, cooler, more yielding, retaining moisture in a way the central fields didn't. The cotton nearest the cabin boundary was, by midsummer, the healthiest on the property. Clement recorded this observation with a note trying to find a rational explanation. Proximity to the water table, a natural depression collecting dew, but the explanation felt insufficient. The difference was too consistent, too localized. Then one of the field hands, a man named Tobias Edo, came to Clement with a report that never made it into the ledger. Tobias said, with the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to navigating dangerous information, that he had observed something on nights of the new moon. Cora came out of her cabin after midnight, when the heat had barely dropped, and walked the perimeter of the garden. She carried nothing visible, but she spoke while she walked, not loudly, not in any way that would carry to the main house. And after completing the circuit, she knelt at specific points among the plants, and stayed there for a time. Tobias said he hadn't been able to hear what she said. He said he hadn't tried. He reported this because he thought Mr. Harland should know, in a tone that suggested he had calculated exactly how that information would land. Clement Harland went back to the eastern boundary the following day. He brought Wesley Prout, who had arrived that morning on another matter and expressed curiosity after Clement mentioned it, over the midday meal. The two men stood at the edge of the garden, not inside it, not past the outer ring of plants, and looked. Later, in a letter to Marcus Delavan, Wesley Prout described what he saw. The letter survives in a private collection, referenced in a local historical study, published decades later. He wrote, "The garden was denser than I had been led to expect, arranged in a pattern I could not attribute entirely to accident or convenience. The smell was insistent and difficult to locate, present in the nose before one registered approaching the place. I felt an unwillingness to step inside it that I found difficult to explain to Harland, which I attributed at the time to the heat. Though the heat was no worse there than in the road. Cora was seated outside her cabin door during our observation and watched us with an expression I can only describe as quiet. That word, quiet, appears repeatedly in white observers' attempts to describe Cora Rue. It was not a comfortable word for them. In the taxonomy available to white men of the Antebellum South, an enslaved woman was supposed to be readable, deferential, anxious, eager to please, or, if resistant, visibly so in ways that could be named and punished. Quiet implied something else. It implied a person looking at you from a place you could not access, and choosing carefully what to show you. Clement asked Cora, in front of Prout, to explain the garden. She did so in terms entirely reasonable. She named the plants he would recognize, described their medicinal uses, spoke of treating minor ailments among the other workers. A service Clement had tacitly permitted for years, because it reduced his expenses on physicians. She was cooperative. Clear. She answered every question he actually asked. He could find no grounds to object, no grounds to order it removed. The garden wasn't interfering with her work. It wasn't on land he needed. It was producing, if anything, a beneficial effect on the adjacent cotton. There was nothing he could point to. He and Prout walked back to the main house in silence. That night, Clement sat with his ledger for an unusually long time without writing anything. By August 1857, the situation had become an active topic of conversation among the four planters. And the conversation had taken on a quality none of them, in private, would have been entirely comfortable acknowledging. They were afraid. Not of anything they could name. Not of anything they could document or justify. But the fear was there in the way they spoke about the eastern boundary. Circuitous, a little too careful. Returning to the subject, and then retreating when they got too close to what they actually meant. Randolph Sutter was the most direct in his private communications. He'd visited Harland in early August to discuss a drainage concern, and made a point of walking the boundary road. In a letter to his brother in Macon, now held in the Sutter family papers at a Georgia historical repository, he wrote, "Harland has a problem he does not know how to name, which is the worst kind of problem for a man of his disposition. The woman at the eastern cabin has made something there that I have seen only in incomplete form before, and which I could not describe to you even if I wished. I will say only that it is not nothing, and that it has an audience among the other people on that property that Harland has entirely failed to appreciate." That phrase, an audience among the other people on that property, was the observation Sutter, for all his bluntness, did not push further, because what was happening at Harland by August 1857 was not simply a woman gardening at the edge of a field. It was something more distributed, more social, more networked than the planters had frameworks to understand. The women from neighboring properties who came to Cora for medicine, counsel, or the particular kind of help that women with no legal rights sought from someone who had knowledge they needed. They brought things with them. Seeds, information, small objects gathered from particular places, and they left with things: dried herbs wrapped in cloth, instructions whispered at the door, recommendations for what to plant and where, and something harder to measure, but consistently reported across later accounts. A changed expression, a different bearing, as though the visit had reminded them of something they had known and been made to forget. Several overseers noticed this change. They noted it the same way they noticed anything outside, established behavioral patterns, with suspicion and tentative investigation that consistently failed to find anything actionable. The women returned with nothing that could be confiscated, having done nothing that could be punished under the rules as written. But something was moving. Something was passing along that network of visits and whispered conversations. And it was moving away from the planters, knowledge and further into a register they couldn't read. Marcus Delavan, the most educated of the four, became the most vocal about his unease. In late August, he visited Clement without notice and asked directly whether he'd consulted anyone about the garden. A physician, a minister, someone with botanical expertise. Clement said he had not. Delavan said he thought this was an error. He said the situation at the eastern boundary was affecting the behavior of people on neighboring properties in ways he couldn't entirely quantify, but was confident were real, and he used the word influence. Said it carefully, then said it again. Clement listened. He asked Delavan to be specific. Delavan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The women who go there come back changed. Not disobedient. Nothing you could discipline. Changed. Like they've remembered something. And the ones who haven't gone yet, they're asking. I've had 2 women on my property ask my overseer in the last week for permission to visit a sick relation at Harland. There is no sick relation. They want to see the garden." Clement sat with this. Then he said he would speak to Cora. He went to the eastern boundary the following morning. He stood outside the garden's perimeter. A fact he did not acknowledge directly in the ledger entry he wrote that evening, but which is implied by the geography of his description. He called for Cora to come out. She did. He told her he was hearing concerns from neighboring planters about the number of outside women visiting. He told her he would need to restrict those visits. "A question of order," he said. Cora looked at him. She said she understood. She said she would receive no visitors who did not have his permission. No resistance. No visible emotion. Quietly. Clement walked back to the house. He felt the conversation had resolved something. He spent most of the following week suspecting it had not. He was correct. Because what none of the 4 planters had understood, what their framework of property and control had made nearly impossible for them to understand, was that Cora's influence did not require visits to the garden. It had already traveled. The women who had been there had carried it home. The women who had heard from those women had received enough. The garden was not the source. It was the symbol. The knowledge was already distributed. In the 3rd week of August, 3 things happened within 4 days that crystallized the fear into something that could no longer be dismissed as discomfort. First, at the Sutter property, a woman named Hetty, who had visited the Harland boundary twice in the spring, was found by the overseer to have planted something along the eastern wall of the cabin row. A low, dense growth of herbs he couldn't identify. He ordered it pulled up. Hetty complied. The plants were gone by morning. By the following week, they had been replanted in 2 different locations, harder to observe, supplemented with seeds that appeared to have arrived from elsewhere. Second, at the Prout property, Wesley Prout discovered that 3 of the women on his property had been meeting before dawn near the tree line for at least 2 weeks. They were doing nothing he could clearly articulate as threatening. They were talking. He could hear their voices, but not their words. When he approached, they separated and returned to their assigned quarters without incident. His overseer reported that when questioned, each woman gave a different and entirely mundane account of why she had been awake before sunrise. Third, at the Delavan property, Marcus Delavan found pressed into the frame of his study window a dried sprig of something he did not recognize. He brought it to a physician friend in Milledgeville, who looked at it for a long time, and then told him it appeared to be a variety of plant in a text on West African botanical traditions that had passed through the college library in Savannah. He couldn't be certain of its local name, but in the context he had read, it was used as a marker, a message. The message, as near as he could determine, was something like, "I know where you live." Delavan went to Clement Harlan that afternoon. He brought Sutter and Prout with him. The four men sat in Clement's study and had a conversation that does not appear in any of their personal writings in full, only in fragments, in the courthouse document, and in careful statements from letters written in the weeks after. What they agreed on at the end of that conversation was this: they would not go to the eastern boundary cabin. Not collectively, not individually. Not to confront, not to investigate, not for any purpose that required them to enter the space Cora had made. The document they eventually filed, a semi-formal declaration between neighbors intended to establish a shared position on a matter of shared concern, reflected this agreement. It stated, in the anodyne language of men needing a legal veneer over something they couldn't fully explain, that the cabin in question was outside the boundaries of reasonable, productive oversight, and that no party to the agreement would be compelled by the others to enter or approach it. They had, in effect, acknowledged a boundary. They had put it in writing. They had done, in legal language, the one thing they had never intended to do. They had recognized, with their signatures, that there was a space on that land they did not control. To understand what those four men were actually afraid of, you have to separate the layers. There were several, and they operated simultaneously. The first layer was practical. Cora had real, applied, verifiable knowledge about what grew in that soil and what it could do. Her preparations were genuinely effective in the way pharmaceutical botanical medicine often was. Pennyroyal as an emmenagogue, black cohosh as a uterine regulator, various preparations as antimicrobials or analgesics. The women who came to her came for real reasons and left with remedies that worked. This gave her a position of authority and trust within the networked community of enslaved women across four properties that no overseer, no ledger, no system of observation could fully map or contain. The planters couldn't surveil that network because they had no access to it and no language for it. What they saw as inexplicable influence was, in part, simply competence in a domain they had systematically excluded themselves from understanding. The second layer was botanical signaling. The garden as a form of communication. Plants have been used as markers of meaning across many cultures. In the community Cora belonged to, certain arrangements carried messages legible to those taught to read them, and entirely opaque to those who hadn't. What Theodora Prout had recognized and couldn't put to paper, what Delavan's physician friend had identified as a marker. These were elements of a botanical vocabulary, a system of meaning embedded in living things. When Cora planted certain combinations in certain arrangements, she wasn't only growing medicine. She was making statements. Statements about sovereignty, about knowledge, about the location and nature of the space she had made. The men couldn't read those statements, but they could feel the fact of their illegibility. And that feeling was, for men whose entire social position depended on the belief that they were the ones who defined reality, deeply and specifically threatening. The third layer was the most human and the most devastating, the mirror. What Cora had built was a space that functioned as evidence. Evidence that the system those 4 men maintained was not total, not complete, not as absolute as its architects required it to be. Every woman who visited the garden and returned changed was evidence. Every replanted herb at the Sutter cabin wall was evidence. Every pre-dawn meeting at the Prout tree line was evidence. Every dried sprig pressed into a study window frame was evidence. Not of supernatural power, not of anything that couldn't be explained by human intelligence, human knowledge, and the extraordinary persistence of human meaning in conditions designed to eradicate it. But evidence, undeniably, that the system had a border, a place where it stopped, and that a woman in a small cabin at the edge of a cotton field had found it, and was standing at it, and had been standing there for a long time. The fear was not of Cora's plants. It was of what her plants represented, that the boundary she had drawn was real, that the knowledge she held was real, that the community she served was real and connected and not contained, that 41 people, and then more still, across 4 properties, were living within the planter's world, but outside it in some fundamental way, in a dimension of relationship and knowledge and meaning that the ledgers could not capture, because the ledgers had not been designed to look there. That was what made 4 men refuse in writing to cross the line, not the plants, the truth the plants were pointing to. In September 1857, Clement Harlan made one more entry in his ledger about the eastern boundary. It read, "The Rue cabin and its surroundings remain unchanged. Work productivity in adjacent fields continues above expectation. No further incidents have been reported from the perimeter. The matter is considered closed for purposes of this record." The matter was not closed. The matter had merely become too large for the ledger. The years that followed did not bring resolution in any tidy sense. History rarely performs that particular mercy. The Harlan plantation continued operating in its brutal, meticulous way through the end of the antebellum period. Clement's ledgers from 1858 and 1859 show no further direct reference to Cora Rue beyond standard notations of name, task, and condition. She continued to live in the eastern cabin. She continued to tend her garden. She continued to receive, in whatever quiet way was available, the women who found their way to her through the networks, beneath the planter's observation. The 4 men maintained their unspoken agreement. There is no record of any of them entering the garden's perimeter after August 1857. Sutter wrote to his brother the following spring that he had resolved the matter at the Harlan boundary to his satisfaction, without specifying what that resolution consisted of. It was the language of a man closing a subject he no longer wished to examine. Randolph Sutter died of a stroke in 1860. Wesley Prout sold his property in 1861 and relocated north. Marcus Delavan tried to sustain his operation through the war and failed. The property was sold at auction in 1866. Clement Harlan survived the war and the loss of the plantation system that had structured his entire adult life, dying in 1871 in reduced circumstances. His ledgers passed through several hands before portions were acquired by a county archive, where they sit today, meticulous and cold, recording the dimensions of a world that has gone. What happened to Cora Rue after emancipation is not recorded in any document that has been located. This is not unusual. The records kept by white men of the period tracked enslaved people as property. Once that legal category dissolved, the record-keeping dissolved with it. She was approximately 42 years old in 1863 when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in the Confederate States. What she did with the years that followed, where she went, whether she found Solomon or learned what had become of him, these things are not known, but the garden was still there in 1866. A Union survey team moving through Baldwin County to assess post-war agricultural conditions, noted in their report the presence of unusual and extensive botanical cultivation around a small outbuilding on the eastern boundary of the former Harlan property. The surveyor did not elaborate. He marked it on his map with a notation that translates essentially to "C note." No note was ever found to correspond to it. The courthouse document, the semi-formal agreement between 4 planters to leave one woman's space undisturbed, survived because courthouse documents were maintained with a bureaucratic thoroughness that outlasted the system they served. It was filed in a general property record section, not flagged as unusual. It sat there for many decades before being identified by a local researcher trying to understand an anomalous reference in the Sutter family papers. Even then, its significance was not fully appreciated. It was classified as a minor administrative record, reflecting a boundary dispute, which was not technically inaccurate, only so incomplete as to be almost meaningless. There is finally the question of what Cora intended. The answer cannot be known with certainty, because Cora Rue left no written record. She lived in a world that had made her literacy a crime, and her knowledge invisible. What she thought, what she planned, what she hoped for. These things exist only in the effects she produced in the document filed by 4 frightened men, in the changed expressions of women returning from her door, in the pre-dawn meetings at tree lines, in a dried plant pressed against a study window in the dark. But the effects themselves are a kind of record, and they tell us that a woman with everything taken from her, her children, her freedom, her name in any register that mattered, built something that 4 men, with all the power of that era at their backs, refused to enter. They tell us she built it from knowledge, from patience, from relationships, from the ground itself. They tell us she drew a line, and the line held. What she planted around one cabin in Georgia in 1857 was not a collection of herbs. It was a demonstration, a proof conducted in soil and silence, that there is a kind of authority that cannot be purchased, cannot be recorded in a ledger, cannot be enforced or revoked by men who do not understand its source. And 4 enslavers stood at the edge of what she made and felt the truth of something they had built their entire world on the denial of, that what she carried was real, that it had weight, that it had. In some way, their systems of measurement were not equipped to quantify. 1. They refused to cross the line, because crossing it would have required them to admit, at least to themselves, that it was there. And if it was there, if one woman in one cabin at the edge of one cotton field had drawn a boundary that could not be erased, then the whole architecture of what they had built began to tremble at its foundations. They signed their names to a document that said, "We will not go near it." And in doing so, they signed their names to something else entirely, to the quiet, permanent, indelible record of her power. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it presses itself between the boards of a courthouse wall and waits. Sometimes it grows back in 2 different locations. Sometimes it walks a perimeter at midnight in a language the men holding the torches cannot read. And it says what it says, and the soil holds it, and the soil remembers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe we've uncovered everything? Leave your comment below. What strikes you most about what Cora Rue built, and what those 4 men refused to face? If you want more stories like this one, stories about the buried, the overlooked, the erased parts of American history that refused to stay quiet, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.